Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob. In today's video, I thought I'd do something a little different and talk about my 10 favorite classic TSR era adventures of all time. So this is going to be like basic set, expert set, companion set even, and then of course AD&D and second edition. And this is not like the greatest adventures ever made. These are just my personal favorites. So there will be some, we'll talk about them once I'm done my top 10, where they just aren't on the list. That doesn't mean they aren't great adventures. It just means that I never played them or ran them as a DM. And this is going to be mostly just based on ones I personally loved or that the players at my table especially loved. And where we'd run later campaigns, they'd want to do some of those same adventures over again, etc. So I figured let's just jump right into it. At number 10, squeezing barely into the list, is Pharaoh. And then beyond that, kind of the Desert of Desolation series in general, of which Pharaoh was the first one. This was Tracy and Laura Hickman adventure. Tracy Hickman's the guy who also gave us Ravenloft and Dragonlance and, a bunch of stuff like that. It did have those 3D maps which were awesome to look at and terrible to try using. They were not great from a DO standpoint as far as like functionality, but they did look good. However, it did have a lot of cool like narrative ideas, which I really liked, and it had some like interesting puzzles and traps and stuff as well. Basically, the players find this like pyramid in a desert and then have to explore it. But it was a pretty cool adventure and one that I remember a lot of my players really enjoying. Number 9, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. This adventure is ridiculous, but it is also fun. If you don't know, the basic idea is that the players have to go explore a dungeon, and this dungeon is up in this mountain range. But when you get there, it turns out it's actually a crashed alien spaceship. And there are laser guns and androids and all sorts of cool things. One particularly funny story is when myself and all my friends this is back in high school, so we're talking like 40 years ago at this point. When we decided to do this adventure, everybody wanted to play evil characters for some reason. So, needless to say, this eventually led to me and the rogue being betrayed by the rest of our party, who basically talked us into jumping into this swimming pool and then left us to fight the Eye of the Deep that was in there, and they took off with all of our gear. Needless to say, we were not too happy about that. And so we decided to try to hunt them down. The rest of the party, though, ran into a mind flayer with a laser cannon trap set up. And he managed to wipe out half of the remaining party members. And so when we caught up to them, the fighter was almost dead. And there was a elven fighter mage who was also almost dead. And just looking at what we had left, me and the rogue realized we didn't have a lot of supplies, but we did manage to hit them with some spells, lured them into an ambush, and then the rogue finished the fighter off with a good old backstab, and we got all of our stuff back, plus took all of their stuff. The cleric in the party, who was dead from the mind flayer, had a portable hole, and that is how we carried out just a truckload of high-tech weaponry that never should have been allowed to our players. Anyways, fun story. Don't betray your party. You might be the ones who, karmically get it in the end. Anyway, number 8. I'll try to move things up a little faster here. The Lost City. This was just a really cool adventure. It had a lot of interesting stuff, especially like the big bad, Zargon, who later returned in like 3rd or 3.5, whatever it was, as like this elder evil. And I liked a lot of stuff with that. It was just a really cool adventure. I do have a few minor issues. There are parts where it's like a monster condominium almost, where it's just, different groups of monsters all living together and no apparent reason or rhyme that should probably be trying to kill each other, but just aren't. But, that being said, it was still a cool adventure, and I liked it a lot. Number 7, The Secret of Bone Hill. This was another really great adventure. I remember we played this one through a couple times, and it was just a lot of fun. I do remember the DM complaining that he had to kind of make some changes towards the end in order to make the final fight a little more climatic, because there really kind of was no ending in his opinion, but I never ran it as a DM, so I don't know if that was true or not, or he just maybe didn't read something, or maybe that really is how it is. All I know is it was a lot of fun. Number 6, The Veiled Society. This one was a really cool murder mystery, and it had like 3 different factions, and the players could like join with different factions or explore them. Basically, you had like a baron, but the 3 factions were trying to basically vie for control over who got to influence the baron, essentially, right? There were some interesting plot twists, and it was just a cool adventure. In fact, this leads me to something that probably would have made the list if it wasn't for the fact that I like the Veiled Society more, and that is the Assassin's Knot, which is actually the follow-up to the Secret of Bone Hill that we just talked about a minute ago. But personally, I thought, well, the Assassin's Knot was a fine adventure. I enjoyed the Veiled Society more and thought that the 3 factions kind of just made things more interesting to me. So, like I said, that's a personal choice. The Assassin's Knot, it would definitely be an honorable mention, but I do sometimes think that I see a lot of people put it above the Secret of Bone Hill, and I personally, like, I played each of them twice as a player, never ran them as a DM, but both times I thought the Secret of Bone Hill was just way more fun. I think that, I mean, the second time through, I think we'd all forgotten who the killer was at that point, so the murder mystery wasn't really ruined for us. But I think that sometimes the Assassin's Knot, being one of the first murder mystery investigation games, kind of gets, I don't know, I don't say overrated, but I think a lot of people remember it more fondly than, in my opinion, it probably deserves. Although it still should be an honorable mention. I'm not trying to say it's bad. Anyway, number 5, Castle Amber. This is one of like the great funhouse dungeons ever. It's kind of similar to, I already mentioned Expedition to Bear Peaks, but there's things like White Plume Mountain and other adventures that are kind of along the same veins as this. But I just felt Castle Amber was better and more fun than any of them. I really, really enjoyed this one. It's another one we ran 2 or maybe even 3 times over the years. It was great. Number 4, The Village of Hamlet. This was one of the very first adventures where I kind of became aware of the using a town as a base of operations to start your players out trope. And I don't know if that's because it was the first time it was ever done or if it was just the first time I noticed it as a player. I was like, oh yeah, okay, that's cool. Now, spoiler alert, I never played the Temple of Elemental Evil. It's going to be down in the others section of this video. We'll talk about it in a moment. Part of the problem was that the Village of Hamlet came out and then Temple of Elemental Evil came out like 4 years later or 8 years later. I don't even know. You can post it in the comments section on how many years it was later. It was a long time, and by then, you know, nobody was saving their characters from the Village of Hamlet to play the next installment. Like, you know, let's be real. But the Village of Hamlet was really fun, and I remember fighting Lilith the Beautiful in the Moat House dungeon, and that was a great fight. Anyway, number 3. This is going to be a pick that I'm sure most people will never see coming. It is Test of the Warlords, Companion Module number 1. I just remember loving this adventure. It doesn't get a lot of praise from anybody else, but I remember running this as a DM and then playing it probably a good 6 or 7 years later as well, and loving it both times. And part of it, I don't think the adventure itself was, like there's some dungeons and stuff, and yeah, they're kind of derivative. You've got these 3 crones that are basically a copy of like the Norns, except for one's, you know, good, one's neutral, one's evil, right? Except it was companion set, so they're all lawful, neutral, or chaotic, because we didn't have lawful good or chaotic evil or whatever else, right? But basically the players just get to go to this new continent, and it's for like level 15 and up, right? Which was pretty rare. We didn't have a lot of high-level adventures back then, especially not 15 and beyond. And players could like claim territory and try to stake out their own kingdoms. And that was something we'd never done in D&D for me and my players, at least not, you know, properly. And there were all these rules in the game about how fighters could like build a stronghold and mages could build a mage tower and these people could attract followers and get lands and stuff. But there was really nothing to explain how any of that worked. And this was the first adventure where, that I played at least, where players could go to this other land, get these things, and like they could build their, you know, their dominion carve it out of the wilderness and kill the monsters and attract people to serve them and collect taxes. And it's just all the cool stuff that you kind of think of high-level characters doing. And it was always mentioned in the rules, but I'd never seen anything based around doing it. And so for me, I really loved the Test of the Warlords. Probably just because I had so much fun, and it was the first time I'd ever really been like, okay, this is how we do all this stuff, and here's an adventure where we actually go about doing all these things, and end up having to lead our little tiny fledgling baronies or whatever into war at the end, and I just thought it was great. Anyway, number 2, the Keep on the Borderlands. There is no adventure in the history of D&D that I have played more than Keep on the Borderlands, and I believe it's the most played adventure of all time. Mostly because it came with the basic red box set of the rules, but this was a great adventure. You just had a keep. It was very sandboxish in a lot of ways. And you had a bunch of NPCs, some of which they didn't even bother to name because, who needs a name? It's just a random NPC, You don't even have a name tag. You have no chance. I think it was from Austin Powers. Whatever. Point is, it was just a cool adventure, though. I love the Caves of Chaos. Me and my players went there just time and time again, and it was like our go-to adventure for like low-level games, because it was like a level 1 to 3 adventure. It was a basic set. But I loved it, and the Keep was like the first place where you had kind of like your base of operations, but I didn't realize that was really what they were doing with Village of Homeland and all these other adventures since then until, years later, right? When I was like, oh, okay. But, it was just a keep, and you had to go destroy it. I never played the follow-up, Return to the Keep on the Borderlands. I'd moved on to like a lot of White Wolf games by then. But I've heard good things about it as well. I should check it out sometime, but I just haven't done that. Either way, though, Keep on the Borderlands, number 2. And that brings us to number 1. My favorite adventure of all time, Ravenloft. Man, I loved Ravenloft. I remember running it for my players, and it's the first time we'd ever run it, right? And I got to the end, and I read like the epilogue text and stuff about like the dawn breaking, the mists over Bavaria parting and everything, and Strahd's brother's ghost like comes to see the players and everything, gives them this farewell message and everything else. And I remember finishing that, and I was expecting everybody to be kind of excited because I thought it was a great ending, right? And I look at my table, and everybody's just dead silence. And I remember it's just quiet for like, it was probably 3 or 4 seconds, but in my mind, it felt like it was like 8 or 10 seconds, right? And nobody's saying anything. And I'm just kind of like, maybe they didn't like it, or maybe they didn't like the ending. And then finally, my friend Ryan just kind of goes, that was the greatest adventure in the history of D&D. And I was like, and then everybody else is like, yeah, that was incredible. And I was like, I thought the same thing. And we were all so excited when we started talking about it after. But like Ravenloft did so many things that were just never done before, right? You had a villain that was actually interesting and it would like spy on the party and like mark their progress and stuff, right? And you had things like the tarot card readings, and like the placement of different items would depend based on whatever readings you got. And I'd never seen anything like that before. It was just such a cool adventure in so many different ways. It was also like very challenging. Strahd was an interesting villain, which was something, like I said, we didn't really see that in D&D modules, Like you'd hear about, people like Ayaz the Old and Igwilv and stuff back then, or Baba Yaga. I remember we got Baba Yaga's Dancing Hut adventure in Dragon Magazine. And so you'd have like these kind of like big ultra baddies. But Strahd at that point was just a vampire, essentially. Like, yes, he kind of became one of these big baddies in the fullness of time. And, Ravenloft became its own campaign setting. We got to return to House on Griffin Hill. Ravenloft got expanded into having a bunch of other things as well, besides just Strahd and Zarovich, I'm less of a fan of what Ravenloft eventually kind of morphed into, or just became this like, let's throw every type of monster horror setting into one, But Ravenloft itself was great. And of course it inspired things like the Curse of Strahd adventure that we have for 5th edition. And I just thought it was an amazing adventure. And again, it was another Hickman Weiss. And it's funny because before you start thinking I'm a fanboy, I have to tell you, the Dragonlance adventures are some of the worst adventures. And I actually owned quite a few of them and ran quite a few of them, which is why I feel qualified to say that they just weren't very good. They kind of tried to like railroad the players into essentially living out a story from the books. And I have no problem with like trying to take some of the events from the book and then building a series around it. But the players need to have their own agency to choose how or if they want to follow the different elements of the story. You cannot just like force them to basically be the characters from the written novels and just relive the novels. What's the point of playing the game if that's going to be the case and if everything's basically predetermined? So personally, I think the Dragonlance adventures were not very good. And they also used the terrible 3D maps. So did Ravenloft, but you know, I mean, it was so good for everything else that I can't punish it too heavily for that. So let's get into some honorable mentions and then just some other ones I just want to talk about. So honorable mentions. The first one is going to be the Isle of Dread, which was the adventure that came in the blue box set for the expert set. And this one was just a really, I think it was the first hexagonal map crawl adventure of all time. But it had some really cool stuff in it, including a lot of like kind of weird Lovecraftian type things. We ran this one multiple times too. I think only once though did my players ever bother to go to the center of the island and actually like scale up to the top and find out. I remember we'd done it 2 or 3 times, and then the one time when people did that, they're like, "Oh wait, there's all this stuff here. We never knew that." I'm like, "Yeah, because you guys have never bothered to go this far." But it's still a great adventure and one that definitely, you know, in a top 20 list, it would definitely be there. The other one, and this one's probably going to be a little controversial as well. This one is the Bloodstone Mine series, particularly H2, which I think is the best one of the series. These were all high-level adventures as well, right? So I think this one was like 16 to 18, but eventually H4 was like 20 to 100 or whatever it was supposed to be, right? And that one's definitely the weakest in the series, by the way. But again, as somebody who just didn't have a lot of high-level adventures to run, we were always trying to make up our own stuff for high-level characters, including like we had multiple incursions into the 9 Hells where we decided we were going to go in and kill a bunch of archdevils. The second expedition was actually somewhat successful. We actually killed a couple of them. But we had like 20 characters that were all like level 15 and up. Some of them were in the 30s even, you know. So that group was ridiculous. But, you know, the first and third were not so good, especially the first. I think everybody died. And we had like 12 or 13 characters in that mission too. But anyways, so we were always trying to make our own high-level stuff. So the idea that they actually were making some high-level adventures, I mean, this is fairly early on in the like second edition era. We later got a lot of other stuff that came after, right? But at this point, this is basically when I stopped playing D&D and started moving on to a bunch of other games. And I just thought these adventures were a lot of fun. Orcus was the main villain, you know, so that's always interesting. Got a bunch of undead, but there was a lot of cool stuff too. Like I remember there was a vampire in the town. The players figured that out. But there's a lot of like just cool stuff in general about like running kingdoms for high-level players. And I know that this adventure has gotten a lot of hate from, you know, other reviewers and stuff over the years. People saying like, this is a reason that high-level characters shall retire. But for me and my players, we all liked it because we just wanted something that was high-level. So I would not necessarily say that it deserves a top 10 spot, but it was a fun adventure and we loved it. So what can I say? That's all that really matters. Anyways, now on to some others. Some of these will kind of fall into the honorable mentions category, I guess, but some of them are just obvious exceptions that aren't on my table, and I want to talk about them. So one of them is Dwellers of the Forgotten City. This is because I just never played it. I know a lot of people have all talked about it, and I think we actually went to run it once, but we probably either didn't or we did one game session, and either way, I don't feel like I'm qualified to talk about it since I never played it or ran it, and I can't really say, oh, it's one of my favorites of all time, just based on reputation, because that's not really fair. So while I'm sure I would have liked it, never had the chance. The next one that kind of falls into the same category is Temple of Elemental Evil, although we are doing that now in our Saltmarsh campaign. Our DM's done like a 5e conversion, essentially. And so who knows? Maybe I'll really enjoy it. But it was another one that I just never played. Like I mentioned before, the gap between this and Village of Honourable was so big that we just, we'd all given up on those characters by the end. Or they'd probably all, they're probably level 15 by the time that the follow-up came out. So that's one that I never played. A couple that I think are excellent, that are definitely in the honorable mention category, are the UK modules. And the reason I didn't mention any of these ones individually is because I kind of wanted to talk about the whole series. And I haven't played the whole series. Like there's Beyond the Crystal Cave. I never played that one, but I know that a lot of people think it's great. But I did play Sentinel and the Gauntlet and ran each of those as a DM. I played them and I've run them. And those were excellent adventures. There's also one, it's not like All the Glitters or something, I think is what it's called. I can't remember off the top of my head. But that one is another one that by reputation is just an excellent adventure. And in general, the UK series were just very well designed and thought out adventures. And they're called the UK ones because they were all made in the UK instead of in America. And I don't know what it was, but clearly someone in the UK was thinking about things like making and crafting well-constructed adventures with problem solving and with role play and with lots of combat and, investigation type stuff. And just kind of giving us a good selection of all these different things while making interesting and compelling stories. And a lot of adventures that we got back then weren't necessarily that. A lot of adventures we get now aren't necessarily that, let's be honest. So in general, the two that I did play, I thought were great. And apparently they're like the two weaker ones in the series. So I'm like, well, if the other ones are even better, then that's a good sign for that entire series. I also wanted to mention Vault of the Drow and Queen of the Demonwood Pits. And I guess the Against the Giants and Descent into the Underdark series in general, because these are classics. But I've played a bunch of the Against the Giants. They're basically just standard dungeon crawls, in my opinion. I didn't think they were anything special. I think they get a good reputation just because they were a coherent series, I guess. And then from them, we get Descent into the Underdark, which were quite excellent overall. I remember running Vault of the Kotoa a couple times, which is funny because it's the one that kind of least fits into the series. Like, there's really no reason to go to the Kotoa city at all. But, whatever. It's still a cool adventure. But Vault of the Drow was generally quite excellent. I know a lot of people hate Queen of the Dimweb Pits, and I do not blame them in the least. It's basically just a killer dungeon where you have to fight a demon queen, Lolth, in her home plane, and it's basically just a giant suicide mission. But it was still a cool suicide mission. And I personally thought that it was a fun adventure. I've played it many times. We had several different parties that thought we could be the ones to kill Lolth, but we'd always give, like, there was an optional rule back then where demon lords and archdevils in their home plane would also have like the abilities of like lesser gods equivalent in their home plane, right? In addition to what they normally had. So we gave them all those optional rules, which made them way harder. And that was probably to our own detriment. But it was just a fun adventure, and I really liked it. I know it's one that most people think is terrible, but whatever. I'm allowed to like something that's bad. It's fine. It wasn't as good though as Vault of the Drow, because not much is, honestly. It was another great adventure. But this brings us then to one of the most obvious, absences from the list, which is one of my least favorite adventures of all time, The Tomb of Horrors. And yes, I know some people are going to think that's basically blasphemy to not like that adventure. But I'm just not a big fan of killer, trap-filled nightmare dungeons to begin with. And I think part of it is that, I've run it once as a DM, and I've played it 3 times as a player. But the first 2 were with the same DM. And, I've heard a lot of interesting stories about people who used the scepter and crown combo to defeat a Sararak. If you know, you know. There's no way my DM would have ever let us do that. he wanted us to actually fight the Demi-Lich, which in first edition was almost impossible to injure. Like you had to have like, paladins with holy avengers or fighters with +5 swords. The shatter spell specifically, most spells it was immune to, but things like forget and shatter worked. Shatter would actually do damage. Forget would just make them lose a turn. You could also have a thief use a sling to hurl these like super expensive gems in the crypt at him. I don't know why it had to specifically be a thief. I don't know why it had to specifically be those gems. Whatever. The point is that almost everything you could do didn't work. And unless you had a party with a bunch of paladins with holy avengers, you weren't going to be able to beat them in combat. I've heard of people doing things like grabbing the head in a bag of holding and throwing that into the green devil mouth. Once again, if you know, you know. Again, there's no way my DM would have let us do that. If we would have, then maybe we would have enjoyed it more. We did have, out of the 3 times I did it as a player, I believe we had 2 players survive once, but we never killed the Demi-Lich. It's just because those players got teleported back to the entrance naked, and then the players were like, yeah, screw this. And their characters just went home. So those guys did live. Overall, I hate adventures that punish players for trying to explore or interact with the dungeon. And I know that that's a lot of the design of the Tomb of Horrors and a lot of other adventures in general. It's not just the Tomb of Horrors, right? But I've literally seen adventures where people are like, this is what the players forget for being curious. And I was like, but I want my players to be curious. I want my players to explore and to try different things and to interact with the dungeon. There's an absolutely great adventure that I'm probably going to do a list of like my top 5 third-party adventures of all time. And this is one that's going to make the list. It's called Death Frost Doom. But unfortunately, what holds this adventure back a little, actually there's a couple things, but we'll talk about that more next time. But one of the problems is there's this like organ, and it's made of bones, right? So it's like human bones and elf bones, dwarf bones, but also monster bones for all the giant pipes and the organ and stuff, right? And hidden through the dungeon are different things of sheet music. And if the players find the music, they can play the music on the organ, and it gives different effects, which I thought was a great idea. The problem is some of these effects are really good and some are bad. And most of the bad ones were permanent and could only be removed by use of a wish spell. But it's an adventure for like 3rd to 5th level characters. Or maybe it was 1st to 3rd even. I can't remember. Low level characters who clearly do not have access to the wish spell is my point. And I just never wanted to have a scenario where my players are going to find this sheet of music, play it on the bone organ, and then just by bad luck, they grabbed one of the ones that's cursed, and now like the character is permanently cursed for the rest of his career. Like that's just not fun to me, and it's not fun to the player either. So I made it so that they could remove these things with a remove curse, or with like I think I said greater restoration as well. But my players were high enough, I think they were 5th level, they had remove curse, right? And I also made the curses so they weren't permanent anyway. Some of them, and then the good ones would give you like bless for 24 hours kind of thing to like all the party members, no concentration, right? That kind of stuff. And the opposite would be giving them all bane for 24 hours. So even if they can't remove the curse, it's not like they're permanently screwed. It's 24 hours, you got a minus D4 to your attack and saving throws. That kind of sucks. But it's not the end of the world, And I find that way too many adventures, they just punish players for trying to have fun. And I really hate that mentality. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't punish your players for being abject, complete, moronic idiots. Because sometimes that's just what's going to happen, If your players are just being complete morons, they probably deserve to get punished. But what's the point of having a dungeon that players are supposed to explore and then punishing them every time they try to explore it? And that's kind of how I feel about the Tomb of Horrors. You got Spheres of Annihilation. You've got players getting teleported naked to the entrance of the crypt, and all their gear gets teleported to the boss's room. You've got players that just get teleported to the entrance, and their gear got teleported to the boss's room, and they're now of the opposite gender and alignment. So, no saving throws, just, oh, wow, had a male character, and now I'm female. Did I want a female? Not really, because otherwise I would have made one. Oh, my character was female, and now they're male. Well, I didn't want that either, because otherwise I could have just made the character male. To me, that kind of stuff, it just isn't fun. And if you can fix it or reverse it, it can be good for a laugh. And I think that with players who just don't care, maybe, or with pre-generated characters you care a little less, I think that that kind of stuff's cool. I think Tomb of Horrors is great as like a one-shot adventure, especially with pre-made characters. But as part of an ongoing campaign where your characters have started at level 1 and worked their way up step by step by step, all of this stuff just isn't great in my opinion. And it's really annoying when I see people talk about how, this is a thinking man's adventure and stuff like that, right? But a lot of the traps are just kind of random. There's really no way the players can figure some of the stuff out and deduce it. Yes, there is a puzzle or a writing or a poem or whatever it is at the beginning of the crypt. And if players adhere to that strictly, that will make their life a lot easier. So I'm not saying that there's no way for players to figure some of this stuff out. I mean, the truth is, if you have a DM who's going to be fair to the players and not try to force them to kill a Sararak, you could probably clear the Tomb of Horrors, like first edition, with a group of level 4 or 5 players. There is a bag of holding in the adventure. If your DM is going to let you mage hand the skull into a bag of holding and then throw said bag of holding into the Sphere of Annihilation, your players could probably do level 3 and do it, if they're smart and if they, actually follow the riddance at the entrance. But, if you start exploring, then they're going to die. And, I don't necessarily think that's great. But anyways, those are my thoughts. Those are my 10 favorite adventures of all time, and just some other great adventures that I've either never played and wanted to talk about, or that I think are of honorable mention, or just obvious exceptions. I know there's going to be people who are like, how could you not like the Tomb of Horrors? And I get it. It is a legend for a reason. It honestly is. Just in my opinion, it's legendarily bad. Whereas other people, I'm sure they're going to be like, man, I love the Tomb of Horrors. What are you talking about? The players did it. And, there's also a sense of pride in doing it legitimately with a DM who didn't pull any punches and defeating the tomb. So I also get that aspect, that you can say we actually beat the Tomb of Horrors and we did it right the way we were supposed to. And, that is kind of awesome, I'm going to say, But hopefully you understand why I probably don't think it's such a great adventure. Anyways, that's everything. Thank you for watching. Give me your thoughts in the comment section. As always, that's always my favorite part of doing these videos, is just reading what other people have to say about them and interacting with the audience. Feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and of course, leave me your comments. That's everything, and I'll see you next time. Bye.